Welcome to the Firebase acronym. I love this simple system, and it will help you avoid mistakes with your camera settings. So the F stands for focus. And do you remember there were only two goals with your camera settings? The first goal is to have a photo that's sharp and it doesn't have any motion blur. And it's also sharp with no focus blur. So focus blur is different from motion blur. All right, you got to keep them separated. Focus blur is caused by an incorrect focus point. Imagine that you're taking a picture of your friend who's standing in front of you smiling while you say cheese. And your friend is standing in front of a mountain view. If your camera moves the focus point away from your friend and onto the mountain, then you're going to have a photo with focus blur on your friend's face, and that's going to make your friend very, very sad. So if you want to keep your friend happy, you need your camera to move the focus point onto your friend's face so it will be sharp and in focus without focus blur. So the first step when you're using this Firebase acronym is to make sure the focus point is actually focusing on the right place in your scene. So I always ask myself, is my focus point set to the right location? And also, do you want autofocus or do you want manual focus? And this is a big one because maybe the last time you used your camera, you were using manual focus. Like, for example, my story I just told you where I was up the night before photographing the Milky Way. And when I went to use my camera the next morning, my camera was still in manual focus mode, but it needed to be in autofocus mode. So F on Firebase is check your focus. Is it in manual? Is it in auto? Which one do you want? And are you focusing on the right place? Then we come to I. The I stands for ISO. You need to check your camera to see what the ISO is actually at. Because once again, you may have been using your camera the last time to be taking nighttime photos and your ISO may be incredibly high, which means that your daytime photos will be grainy and noisy and not usable. So is your ISO at its lowest setting to avoid noise, or do you need your ISO to be a little higher so that it lets in more light to your camera? The main thing here is just take control of the ISO and know what it's set at. I have ruined so many photos because I forgot to check what the ISO was set at. Next one is R for raw. If you're taking outdoor photos of any kind, macro, wildlife, landscape, anything, you want to be shooting in raw mode. But when you buy your camera and you take it out of the box for the first time, it will be set at the factory so that your camera is taking photos in JPEG files. And that's fine for quick snapshots. But if you want to get serious about your photography and you really want to take stunning photos, then you need to change that setting. Make sure you're in RAW. When you shoot in RAW, your photos will have so much more light information, and you can do so much more with the photo and with your post-processing. And specifically, you can change the color temperature, and you cannot do that with a JPEG photo. So you need to check this. Is your camera set to RAW instead of JPEG? Like, take control of your camera. Now, the E is for EV. And this is a little button. It has a little plus and a minus symbol on it. And it's known as exposure compensation, but it is such a powerful little button. And it's so easy to use once you get to know it. I'd like you to think of this little EV button like the knob on your toaster in your kitchen. Like, have you ever put some slices of bread into your toaster and then you press the toast button, you pull down on the slider, and then your toast pops up, but it's not cooked enough. It's still bread. It hasn't become toast. And you go, oh, darn it, I wanted toasty or toast. So what is it that you do in that case? You rotate the little knob on your toaster and it kind of lengthens the amount of time that the cooking will take place for. So this is how you actually get toast, right? And it's how you make an adjustment. And this is exactly how your camera's EV button works. So after you take a photo, you need to review the photo that you just took on the back of your camera. In other words, you look at the photo you just took, and then you determine, is it too bright? And if it's too bright, you need to rotate that dial on your toaster down a little bit. So that's the EV button. And just go to a -1 and then take the photo a second time. And likewise, the opposite. If your photo is coming out too dark after you review it, just rotate to a +1 and then take it again. So this will achieve for you the second goal of camera settings. Remember, there's two goals. The first one was to have a sharp photo. The second one is to have a correctly exposed photo, like that you won't have highlights that are overexposed, that are too bright. And you do this with this EV button. You rotate the knob on your toaster so that your toast comes out just the way you like it. Crispy a little bit, but not too much. So the takeaway here is take control of the EV. The B stands for bracketing. And I use bracketing to help me take HDR photos. I like taking HDR photos, but the biggest mistake I can make is that I forget to turn bracketing off. And so I get to the next photo shoot and this setting is still on. So the big thing with the B is just check, is your bracketing turned off or is it on if you actually want it? So I always need to check this. You may wish to use bracketing if you're taking a photo where you have a really, really bright sky and a really, really dark foreground, like a canyon, a sunset over a canyon. And this is where you can use bracketing. So take control. Is bracketing on or off? A is for aperture. This is the big one. And this is the first setting that I check when I'm about to take a photo. I'll make a decision on what aperture I want to use based on how much of the scene I want to be sharp. So if you're taking that picture of your friend who's smiling at you in front of the mountain scene, and you want your friend's face to be sharp, but you want the mountain behind to be blurry, then you are going to want to select an aperture number, which is also referred to as an f-stop number, that is the lowest one on your lens. So like, for example, f2.8. But if you want your friend's face to be sharp and you also want the mountain behind your friend to be sharp, then you want a high f-stop number, like f9, for example. So you need to just ask yourself, take control, look at what your aperture is and ask yourself, how much do I want to be sharp from the foreground to the background? And then make an adjustment on your aperture based on that. The main thing here is take control. Don't let your camera make that decision for you. The S is for shutter speed. And remember our first goal of our first of the two goals of camera settings, which is to get a sharp photo, right? That's goal number one, get a sharp photo. And remember that getting a sharp photo is split into two. There's two pieces to getting a sharp photo. And shutter speed that we're looking at now relates to one of those pieces, and it's called motion blur. For the minimum shutter speed to use when you're hand holding your camera. And that simple formula is to double the focus length. So for example, focal length. So if you were using a 200 millimeter lens, so you're zoomed in at 200 millimeters, which is a lot of zoom, you would double that number and you'll come out at 400. And then now you know what your minimum shutter speed should be, 1/400th of a second. So this shutter speed will help you avoid motion blur caused by the camera shake in your hands, or if you're photographing things that are moving, like moving cars, moving people, moving animals, you need to even maybe adjust your shutter speed up from there. The big takeaway is be aware of your shutter speed. Know, absolutely know, how fast should it be, and take control. So now we're at E, we're at the last letter of Firebase, and it's excruciating. It's the word excruciating. You absolutely need to pay excruciatingly attention to detail. You must do this, because if you're not paying attention to every little detail and every little letter of this acronym, then you're going to make those mistakes. They're painful, they're frustrating, and they have made me want to give up so many times on my photography. And the worst thing is that often you don't discover that you've made a mistake until you get home from your photo shoot, and by then it's too late. So are you paying excruciating attention to detail? Check and triple check every setting. And this entire process will become automatic for you. It'll become like a muscle memory, and it'll become easy. But easy is what your goal is. And that's why using a system like this little acronym, this is your one pager, right? The astronaut wanted a one pager. I wanted a one pager. I created it, and now you can use it. One more thing about the acronym. I kind of stuck one final letter onto the end, and it's review. So after you take each photo, are you reviewing it? Are you reviewing it to make sure it's correctly exposed? And maybe you need to make an adjustment on that EV button I told you about. And are you reviewing it to make sure your photos are sharp, zooming in on the photo and looking closely? So does this make sense to you? Do you think you can use this little system that I've just showed you? It's been I don't want to say life-changing for me, but it's really turned my photography around, and it's made things so much easier with my photography. Tell me if this makes sense for you.